Let's go live to Roma in Queensland. Our political contributor, Chris Uhlmann, joins me. Chris, the energy rebate, which is going to everyone, it's dominated much of the reaction to this budget. Understandably, I guess, given the intensity of the pressures right now when it comes to cost of living.
Yeah, but let's rewind to the last election campaign, Kieran, which you would remember as well as I, and Chris Bowen, the Climate Change and Energy Minister, went to that election with a policy that said that electricity prices would fall because of the policy that they were taking, and by 2025 electricity prices would be $275 lower than they were at the last election, because he said more renewable energy on the system, which is cheaper, would mean cheaper retail prices. Now, that never made any sense. At the time, it was disputed that that was going to happen. The government always challenged that it was the Ukraine war that drove up gas and oil prices. But that has settled now. So the government is now handing out money to people to try and fill this hole. And so, by the way, are state governments as well. So where is all the cheap energy that we were promised? I think that is the central question for the government. If you do really want to cut inflation, then actually cut energy prices. And the trajectory that we're on is not doing that.
The Future Made in Australia initiative, it looks like, and it's relevant to what you're saying there as well, because it goes to the whole vision of the government on industry and energy. But this is the key battle line out of this budget over coming months, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, you can understand why the Albanese government is doing this, because they look around the world and everybody is working in this space at the moment. The United States has its Inflation Reduction Act, and don't forget that we're talking about $350 billion going into that, about $32 billion a year. The European Union's doing it, Japan's doing it, South Korea's doing it. But in fact, they're all reacting to one player, and that is China. China spent $80 billion in the last financial year on clean energy. It is flooding the world with solar panels that are so cheap they're being used as fencing in Europe. No one can compete with that, and they can't compete with their electric vehicles. When you look at the amount of money that's being put into this by the Albanese government, $22 billion over 10 years, $3.4 billion over the forward estimates, it is a drop in the bucket. And if we intend to make solar panels here, there's no way we can compete. They will always have to be more expensive and probably a lesser product. So they're in a very difficult space. I appreciate the position that they're in, but I don't know that this is going to do a whole lot to encourage that kind of industry here.
Chris, what's your read on the election timing as you look at the wash-up of this budget?
Kieran, this is the famous question, the great question in politics is, when will the Prime Minister hold the next election? And you and I know the iron rule of politics is the Prime Minister will hold that election when the Prime Minister thinks he can win that election. So he'll see what comes out of this budget. He'll be keeping a close eye on what happens to interest rates. Looking at where we are at the moment, you wouldn't expect that they would fall until at least the end of this year and maybe the beginning of next year. He'd want to see that before he goes to the polls. But most likely he will go to an early budget sometime in March next year and then to the polls in May, unless, of course, there's such a stunning response to this, Kieran, that he's so loved by the Australian populace who now have the $300 that was promised, even by way of a government grant, into their kick for electricity prices that he's carried on their shoulders to an election victory. But I think that's a little unlikely too.
What's the implication out of all of this for the budget reply and Peter Dutton's response come tomorrow?
Yeah, and we're at that stage of the election cycle too, Kieran, where again, Peter Dutton is going to have to lay down some markers, and given that cost of living is clearly one of the big ones, and energy prices are one of the big ones, he'll have to talk about what he will do in the near term. Now, it's all well and good to talk about nuclear energy, and it may well need to be part of the mix as we get 10, 20 years down the track. But in the short term, you need to bring down energy prices, and the only way you can do that is by putting more gas into the system. Now, every time I make this argument, you get some blowback from people saying, you must be against renewable energy. No. The only way to maximise the amount of renewable energy, weather-dependent energy on the grid, is to have something that can match its peaks and its troughs, because it leaves an enormous void. So that will be gas. And as long as the gas price is high, if we don't have enough supply, then the price of electricity will be high, because no matter what Chris Bowen says, the price of electricity is set by the highest cost of generation in the market, not the lowest. And that's why your retail bills will not necessarily follow that trajectory down. And by the way, one last point on this, we have yet to build the 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines. So in the short term, we might see some relief on energy prices, but in the long term, what you're going to see is at least 40% of your bill being driven by the fact that those transmission lines have to be built, they have a regulated rate of return, and that goes on your bill.